Hi everybody, I'm finally getting the first towns and cities videos out. Sorry it took so long, but I wanted to make sure I did this topic justice. It's kind of a broad topic, so to start off with, we're going to begin with just NPCs. We're going to go through, we're going to figure out all the important people that you need to have in your town. You're probably thinking that seems ludicrous. Why on earth would I focus on the NPCs if I don't really even have a town to begin with? How does that make sense? But I'm going to pitch 5 questions to you that, if answered properly within the context of your NPCs, will tell you most of what you need to know about your town. The two aren't completely separable, but I think you'll understand my process as I take you through it. NPCs are what breathe life into any given town, city, stronghold, location, whatever. Otherwise, since this is a imaginative medium, you are saying, oh yeah, you see more ruins over there. Yes, your character sees them. That's not particularly engaging, so you're somewhat limited in your options to bring a town to life, and a great way to do that is by personalizing it. Alright, let's get this rolling. So, first question is, does this town have a hat? Planet of the Hats is an old kind of TV trope where everybody within a specific culture, they have that one special thing that they do and that kind of defines them. Granted, it's somewhat lazy when it comes to writing a story, but we haven't gotten to the story part yet because that's what takes place at your table. Mostly, anyways. When you're just starting off by determining who is going to be important within this town or city or such, it's actually a really fantastic shortcut. So in my last campaign, the players would often take a trip down to a city-state called Nabta. It was separated from mostly everything else on the map by a very large desert, which they would occasionally traverse. Don't necessarily think Sahara, think more maybe fantasy Australia. Wild and dangerous place, and every time they went down there, they would get attacked by something, like this guy, for instance. It was, it's still one of my favorite moments from the campaign, I'm not gonna lie. But anyways, Nabta's primary export is explosives and incendiaries. Now obviously, yes, that's not all that they do. It couldn't be all that they do, but nevertheless, it's their most notable export. Most notable export being the things that the players are most likely going to be interested in. It's a coastal town. They do things like fishing. They have a lot of pearl divers. They harvest semi-rare and semi-precious materials from a coral reef that's just off the coast. And at any given moment, alchemists and tinkerers are working on their primary export, which are things like incendiary ammo for howitzers and cannons. I have a lot of homebrew stuff when it comes to artillery within my campaign. That is that culture's hat. It is their primary export. I just need to reiterate this because I know that somebody's going to comment on it at some point in the future. That's not all they do, it's just the most important thing they do within the context of what the players need. Incendiary ammo for the cannons on our airship is their portal, their gateway, their window into how this culture survives, acts, thrives, etc. And so what that does is it contextualizes who it is when the players come here that they're going to be looking for. For instance, in this city-state, the garrison commander was the man that they went to for most of their sales when it came to, oh, well, we pillaged these cannons from an enemy ship, and you're the chief military officer here, so here you go. Would you like to negotiate for these? And he would. One of my players wanted to build a magic item, and it required 3 pearls worth 10,000 gold each, as well as some other things. This is a place with a number of alchemists working on things like, you know, various potions, water breathing for instance. Maybe they're not doing it all the time, they're probably not doing it all the time, but it's something they probably have on hand, or at the very least know how to make. Coral reef off the shore, they have a lot of divers. You can see where I'm going with this. Any number of, you know, rare precious materials might be under there, but pearl diving, that's, you know, that's not hard to come by. They came there for things like explosives. Once they actually got there, however, the window into these people's lives opened up, and they stepped through. You don't really step through a window all that often. Door into their lives, we'll say. But yeah, first step, figure out if this city or town or whatever does anything special. The NPC doesn't even have to be really involved with whatever it is that the town does that the players might be coming there for. Just realize who is it that the players might see as they're running through here. What draws the players in, And who are they going to be talking to in order to get that thing? You're always going to have somebody say that they want to go to the general store because they want some oil, or you're going to have somebody go to the blacksmith or something of that sort. Once you have that one person that they're going to need to see because they came here for that one thing, that's where that opens up. Question number 2. Who practices magic? Now, smaller towns, it's entirely plausible for there not to be any kind of magic caster, and some towns and cities within your setting are going to be openly hostile to magic users, if you make them that way. But if that's not the case, then you're probably going to have a wizard. Wizard is usually going to be your go-to for this sort of thing. They're scholarly, we think of them as taking on apprentices, they have a very large selection of spells, meaning that they can, be used as solutions for a number of different problems, except anything to do with combat. Never mind! In all seriousness, if you need a magic wheelbarrow, we're gonna go to the wizard. He's got you covered. Well, what would you use some of these other casters for? Well, clerics are a pretty obvious choice if there's any kind of hospital or any kind of major temple in town. They're there to care for the sick, the wounded. They're in reserve for armies when they go out, marching to whatever grand threat needs to be dealt with. And specifically, not with an adventuring party, because the first thing that your players may ask, they may do it out loud, they're probably going to do it in their head though, hey, why isn't this guy dealing with this? Because he has to worry about the city. After that, let's go with Druid. This probably isn't going to be as useful for a non-industrial town, but if you have something like a floating city or a castle in the sky or something out in the wilderness, a Druid really isn't a bad thing to have about. He can be somebody that the players consult on any kind of, frontier creatures that are threatening various settlements. Maybe he's proficient in something like alchemy. If your players are dealing with something like Fey creatures, or perhaps even going into the Fey Wild, a Druid NPC is an excellent go-to to give them the 3-minute pamphlet on what the Fey Wild is. Bards are, let's be honest here, they're pretty obvious. You're mostly going to find these in large cities, and they're probably going to act as some sort of counselor to, a king, a regent, or maybe it's a more shadowy organization. Could be a thieves guild. Could be something like a cabal of enchanters and enchantresses. That's more along the lines of bad guy prep, but if the players go seeking that sort of thing out, it's not bad to have in the back pocket. Sorcerers they're odd because they occupy a similar niche to wizard, but I actually think of sorcerers as being your go-to guy for, hey, go obliterate that. The sorcerer is the guy that you want to solve for, actual combat problems. He's competent, he's charismatic, he knows how to change his spells in order to actually, adjust to different situations as opposed to actually just changing the spell that he's casting. That didn't make sense. We're going to try that again. What the sorcerer changes is the quality of the spell, not the actual spell itself. In this way, he's qualitatively different, if you will excuse the pun, in purpose from your general wizard NPC. If you want to send a singular magic user to go devastate an enemy encampment, or to help defend an army against magical attack, a sorcerer is actually really not all that bad. Now, Warlock is difficult. If you're setting him up as a bad guy NPC, you don't really need to get into characterization because, again, that goes more along the lines of, big bad evil guy, or maybe one of his lieutenants. Nevertheless, something like an Archfey Druid could serve as a pretty... what's the word? An Archfey Warlock is analogous in some sense to the Druid. If you're concerned with arcane or bizarre rituals going on in the frontier, weird and strange happenings with Fey, Archfey Warlock isn't really a bad go-to. Fiend and Great Old Ones, they're kind of out. We all understand this, kind of out by their nature. Nevertheless, that's not all you have to work with. Now, several of these have been released in Unearthed Arcana and in published supplements. Now, the Hexblade Warlock is actually a pretty good choice as far as an arcane warrior goes for leading your army. A bunch of you are, at this moment, thinking, well, what about the Eldritch Knight that we used to have? Oh, we're not talking about that. A Celestial Warlock is actually a pretty interesting addition to any kind of temple, barring that, a university or place of learning. Pairing it up with a Paladin of sorts is, you have narrative potential there. I'm not sure exactly what its niche is, but it's in the sort of like general good guy category, so you're probably going to have to invent the context for that on your own. I'm not sure if I can help you there. Then there was that Warlock of the Raven Queen, and that's, it's not impressive mechanically, but thematically, if you have somebody who's in charge of tending to the dead, maybe on the battlefield, maybe just within the city, you have a narrative context for that. This, out of pretty much everything I've mentioned, not the most likely for the characters to interact with. Relatively easy to manage, you just have to categorize them by, their purpose. You might be concerned that in a large city you have to worry about an ever-expanding cast of, magic users and things of that sort. That's BS, don't worry about it. Just make one guy the big guy for magic items, one guy's the big guy for alchemy and things of that sort, potions. If you were running in my setting, you would have one big guy for airship enchantments and things of that sort, and that would be it as far as one extremely large city goes. Because at that point, all the other mages, well, if one guy's got the market, he doesn't really need to have a monopoly on it per se. He just has to have a big enough share of the market so that he's the person that people generally go to when it comes to magic items. After that, all the other mages get to do things like go out and adventure, for instance. Moving on to question number 3, who gets involved when a fight breaks out? This one is not all that difficult to figure out in the context of a singular NPC. It is, on the other hand, important to have stat blocks ready for guards when it comes to your city. Also not terribly difficult, seeing as though there are plenty of guard and veteran stat blocks in both the Monster Manual and Volo's Guide to Monsters. Nevertheless, a Captain of the Watch, as it goes, could be a valuable quest NPC when it comes to things like hiring players as bounty hunters. If your city is large enough, they could be targeting various thieves guilds. They could be investigating suspicious murders that might have something to do with an extraplanar influence. Important records or dossiers being burned could be the important start of a new quest. If your players play nice and make friends, they could gain access to valuable privileges. Skill trainers, audiences with nobles, kings, or whatever council runs the city. Special access to munitions or weapons that might be banned within the city's walls. And all of this isn't to mention a good reputation with an NPC that can really be a shoulder to lean on in trying times. And also has the resources and manpower to be of some real help, especially if it lies within the city's walls. I see a lot of DMs pulling this off really well online. Originally, whatever guards, captains, whatever, are distrustful, let's say, suspicious of the party and or their allies. You're going to see why I structured these questions like I did in just a moment. Question 4. Who steps up when the city is threatened? This probably isn't going to come up unless you plan for it, but it is always important that we acknowledge that our players can do things that we were seriously not expecting. And so if you put the Tarrasque in your campaign, for instance, I don't know why you would do that, but if you did, it's very possible that your players could possibly lead them to a city or an enemy army. Leading the enemy army to the city, not the Tarrasque to an enemy. They could do that too. Keep this in mind. If you have both an enemy army that the players are facing and a Tarrasque, the players will immediately think, can we get the Tarrasque over there? But the Tarrasque is not an NPC as far as I can tell, and so we're getting back on track. Battles, as far as I understand it, in the Middle Ages were relatively rare compared to sieges. 500 knights duking it out in the middle of nowhere would, it would happen on occasion, but that would be the deciding victory for more than you would expect. If you wanted to gain the upper hand, the other way was to capture cities, for the obvious reason. Now, maybe that's partially historically accurate, and additionally, maybe there are factors in your campaign which make that a little less likely to be the end-all be-all. I can think of this in my own campaign where most factions are going to have quite a bit of difficulty invading without encountering at least some kind of fighting force out in the wild. And that includes things like airships. You also have to contend with perhaps high magic in your own campaign. All of that aside, however, that doesn't mean that sieges are never going to happen. Far from it. And sieges can be relatively high stakes, especially if it's a place that your players are attached to, and B, if your players are low level. Low here meaning that they couldn't impact enemy armies on their own by way of things like assassinating VIPs and things of that sort. Or at the very least unlikely to. So for that purpose, low probably means under 7th level. And that doesn't mean that 8th level characters are ready for that sort of thing, certainly not by default. So in this instance, we have the past 2 questions that we just asked. Who practices magic in your city? And who gets involved when a fight breaks out? There's really no building unique NPCs here, except of course if your town guard, your town watch, and the city's main fighting force are completely separate. In which case, basically wash, rinse, and repeat whatever you did for your captain of the watch, and maybe make him relatively higher level. Not everything has to be unique. The building of NPCs here within the context of your town is who's going to volunteer. Something like this is an opportunity for powerful political figures to get together and hold council. Not just powerful political figures in terms of nobles, but people by virtue of having power are necessarily political. And that's going to include your adventurers at some point. It's if you're running anything with any kind of complexity within the scope of cities and towns, which you're by no means required to, but if the thought crossed your mind, it's going to happen at some point. This is a great opportunity to more personalize NPCs, especially ones that you've had on the back burner, but your player characters haven't interacted with them yet for whatever reason. This is your excuse to telegraph to the players that they are important merely by dumping them in the same room. Anybody in the War Council is going to be considered somewhat important. This is also a great opportunity for certain rivalries to come out. Rivalries between certain nobles, between nobles and whoever heads the military faction, between the military faction and whatever mages around. A mage, for instance, might be like, oh yes, I need these 3 companies to protect me as I do my one spell. And he's going to be like, no, you need to be tossing fireballs while my men run up and shank those guys. Nothing more than a reversal of basic tactical decisions. And you have that even though you don't necessarily have 2 military commanders in the same room. They're both discussing tactics, it's just who it benefits more. Because the mage is going to be like, oh, I'm mighty and imperious and necessary. And he might even be right. But that doesn't mean that the other guy is going to think so. So there's your lesson in dramatic setup for the day. Now we're finally on to the last question. To finally tie up our loose ends, who sells what? This is somewhat unrelated to the last question, though obviously whoever's holding a certain number of valuable resources or supplies is going to come into play when it comes to enchanting things, supplying the town guard, supplying the military, whoever it is that has that spark of ingenuity when the town comes under siege. But nevertheless, I do want this to remain somewhat independent. So, who sells what? And also importantly, who sells what from what? That'll make sense in a moment, I promise. There's a number of things that you need to keep track of when it comes to what is it that your players are going to spend gold on. Some of it's idiosyncratic, like in my campaign, for instance, I didn't like the number of things that players had to spend gold on after they were second level. So I invented a number of in-game resources, tools, traps, kits, all number of object, munitions, explosives, pneumatics, which were an interesting thing to play with. I, for instance, had to keep in mind who was it that sold and built parts for airships, who built compressed air mechanics, pneumatics, and any weapons built from them. Who was it that primarily exported firearms? Who harvested unnatural or supernatural or otherwise magical materials, or things that, are analogous to the real world but don't quite exist? Then there were the things that pretty much every GM needs to worry about. Is there an herbalist or an alchemist? Is there somebody that sells or buys precious metals and resources? Is there a general store? What about people who sell services that are exclusively non-material? Is there a mercenary band in your game? Are there guides or rangers that take people from place to place in a kind of points of light setting? Then there's selling items with a more magical focus or selling services with a more magical focus. And that might not feature in your game at all. But we'll end off with the good news. You don't need much when it comes to these NPCs besides a name and written next to that name what that occupation is. You should probably keep it on a spreadsheet, but a notebook will do in a pinch. Their characterization is usually pretty simple unless they're a part of a greater plot or narrative, or if one of your player characters takes an interest in them for no apparent reason, which can also be a pretty fun role-playing opportunity, so I'm not begrudging them for that. But by and large, when it comes to the context of what the players are going to interact with them, they have pretty much the same motivations. I'm going to do my work, I'm going to make my sales, I'm going to be what I can be, so I can go home to my family and make my gold at the end of the day. I think that's mostly going to wrap this up for tonight. I'm getting a huge respect for Matt Colville. He doesn't really do long videos anymore, but he used to. And after editing these, and this is just in audio form, I'm getting more and more impressed. Then again, he's had a lot more time to do this than me. Again, sorry the video came out so late. I have had a very busy week, very busy schedule, but I'm clearing a lot of it out because I'm going to have more and more content for you guys soon. That doesn't just mean videos, that also means things like, for instance, I am starting a new campaign soon with noticeably less players, which excites me. I also may or may not be writing an RPG of my own. Of course I'm not. Why would I do that? I will, of course, have some of my own supplements and stuff like that. But besides that, I am going to start doing things. I think I'm going to do a video on magic items soon because I really like talking about those. Please like, share, and subscribe. That really gives me... I know everybody says that, but like for real, it really gives me an indication as to how my metrics are going, how I'm performing. If you have a specific request for a video, it is, of course, going to be on my Facebook page, a questionnaire on what you would like to see next. But if you'd want to just drop something in the comments below, like, hey, can you do this? Like, my channel's still really small, so if you see this and you're like, well, I want a video on this, I might very well just do it. It's 100% of the firebolts you don't cast. God, that's cringy. Okay, all right, we're done. We're done. Thank you guys for making it this far. Again, thank you.